There's a particular kind of arrogance that comes from never having been truly tested. Jean-Claude Van Damme had conquered Hollywood with his high kicks and splits, turned himself into a brand, a spectacle. But spectacle isn't the same as substance, and somewhere along the way he'd forgotten that martial arts wasn't just about the cameras and the choreography. When he walked into Chuck Norris's quiet dojo in Texas, he wasn't looking for wisdom or training. He was looking to prove something, to validate himself by standing where legends stood. What he didn't understand was that some men don't need to prove anything anymore because they've already walked through the fire and came out the other side. Chuck Norris had spent decades learning that real strength whispers while weakness shouts. And when Van Damme kept pushing, kept testing, kept demanding the kind of attention his ego craved, he was about to learn the difference between a performer and a warrior. Some lessons can only be taught once. This was going to be one of them. The morning air in Texas carried that particular quality of stillness that comes just before something shifts. Chuck Norris stood in the center of his dojo, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of a town most people drove through without stopping. The space was utilitarian, almost austere. Wooden floors worn smooth by decades of bare feet, walls lined with photographs of students rather than trophies, a simple shrine in the corner with a single candle. At 73, Chuck moved through his forms with the same precision he'd had at 30, though now there was something else in the movement, something that transcended technique. It was the movement of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all himself. His students were arriving for the morning class, a mixed group ranging from teenagers to a few folks in their 60s. This was how Chuck preferred it. No egos, no hierarchies beyond respect and experience. Just people trying to better themselves, trying to learn discipline and self-control in a world that seemed increasingly to value neither. He bowed to them as they entered and they bowed back. Simple. Plain. Honest. That's when he heard the distinctive rumble of an expensive car pulling up outside, the kind of engine that announced its arrival, that demanded to be noticed. Through the window, Chuck watched a black Porsche park at an angle that took up 2 spaces. The door opened and Jean-Claude Van Damme stepped out, wearing designer sunglasses and a leather jacket that probably cost more than some of Chuck's students made in a month. Even from a distance, Chuck could read the body language. Chest forward, shoulders back, that particular swagger of someone used to being recognized everywhere he went. Chuck had met Van Damme before years ago at an industry event. They'd been cordial, professional. But Chuck had sensed even then the hunger in the younger man, the need for validation that no amount of success seemed to satisfy. It was a hunger Chuck recognized because he'd felt echoes of it himself once, back before he understood that constantly trying to prove yourself was just another form of insecurity. Van Damme pushed through the dojo doors without knocking, without waiting. The students paused mid-bow, uncertain. Chuck simply stood, hands at his sides, and waited. There was no need to rush toward conflict. It always arrived on its own schedule. Chuck Norris, Van Damme announced, removing his sunglasses with a theatrical flourish. His accent was thick, his smile confident. The legend himself. I was in the area, thought I would stop by, see where the great Chuck Norris teaches his students. He looked around the dojo with an expression that wasn't quite dismissive but wasn't quite respectful either. Smaller than I expected. More humble. Chuck nodded slightly. Humble is good. Keeps us honest. Welcome to my school, Jean-Claude. What brings you by? Van Damme walked further into the space, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden floor. A few students recognized him and whispered to each other. He clearly heard them and seemed to feed off the recognition, his smile widening. I am in Texas filming a new project. Action film, very big budget. And I think to myself, Jean-Claude, you are so close to Chuck Norris's dojo. You should visit. Pay respects. Maybe train a little, you know? Show the students what real movie martial arts looks like. There it was. The edge beneath the courtesy. Chuck had been teaching long enough to recognize every variation of ego that walked through his door, and this was a particularly polished version. Van Damme wasn't here to learn or to pay genuine respects. He was here to be seen, to associate himself with Chuck's legacy, maybe even to subtly suggest he belonged in the same conversation. My students train in traditional martial arts, Chuck said evenly. Not movie fighting. Different purposes, different approaches. Both have their place, but I keep them separate here. Van Damme's smile tightened just slightly. Of course. Traditional. But surely you can appreciate what I do? The athleticism, the difficulty? The way I brought martial arts to millions of people who never would have seen it otherwise. Chuck gestured to his students. These folks are here to learn discipline, self-defense, and respect. That's the focus. If you'd like to observe the class, you're welcome to. If you'd like to participate as a student, You're welcome to do that too. The word student hung in the air. Van Damme's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In his world he was the star, the draw, the name above the title. The idea of being just another student in someone else's class clearly didn't sit well with him, even if that someone was Chucknorris. Maybe I could demonstrate some techniques? Van Damme suggested, his tone still friendly but with a harder undertone. For the students? They could learn from watching real professional technique. Chuck felt the familiar weight of a decision point. He could accommodate Van Damme's ego, let him have his moment, and send him on his way satisfied. Would be easier. But there was something about the way Van Damme was positioning himself, the way he was treating Chuck's students like an audience rather than practitioners, that rubbed against everything the dojo represented. This is a school, not a showcase, Chuck said, his voice still quiet but carrying absolute authority. Everyone who trains here does so with humility. That's the first requirement. Van Damme's smile vanished completely. Humility? You are going to lecture me about humility? Chuck, with all respect, I have done more for martial arts and film than almost anyone. I have inspired millions. I have brought honor to the art. And that's great, Chuck replied. But in this dojo none of that matters. Here you're either a student learning or a guest observing. Nothing more, nothing less. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Chuck's students had stopped pretending to warm up and were openly watching now. Van Damme looked around the room, perhaps expecting someone to defend him, to acknowledge his status. No one did. These students had been training under Chuck long enough to understand what he valued, and celebrity wasn't on the list. You know what I think? Van Damme said, his accent thickening with irritation. I think maybe you are afraid. Afraid that if I show what I can do, these students will see that movie martial arts is just as real, just as impressive as your traditional way. Chuck absorbed the words without reaction. He'd been insulted before, challenged before, disrespected before. When you'd spent decades in martial arts, you learned that the loudest voices were usually covering for the deepest insecurities. But there was something particularly grating about Van Damme's approach, the way he was trying to turn Chuck's students into props for his own ego validation. Jean-Claude, Chuck said, and there was something in his tone that made even Van Damme pause. I've competed in tournaments, won championships, fought full contact before there were pads and safety regulations. I've been knocked down and learned to get back up. I've trained students who've gone on to become champions themselves. I've spent 50 years learning that the most important victories are the ones nobody sees, the quiet battles with yourself to be better than you were yesterday. So no, I'm not afraid of anything you might demonstrate. I'm just not interested in turning my students' training into a performance. Van Damme's face flushed. Then maybe you should be interested. Maybe your students deserve to see what's possible when you stop being so humble and traditional and start thinking bigger. Bigger isn't always better, Chuck replied. Sometimes it's just louder. That did it. Van Damme's composure cracked completely. You know what? I challenge you. Right here, right now. Let's spar. Let's show these students what happens when traditional meets modern, when humble meets ambitious. Unless you are too old, too afraid, too stuck in the past. Chuck's students shifted uncomfortably. A few looked angry on Chuck's behalf. One of his senior students, a woman named Maria who'd been training for 15 years, actually stepped forward as if to intervene. Chuck raised a hand slightly and she stopped. The truth was, Chuck had been in this position many times before. Challengers, ego-driven visitors, people who wanted to test themselves against his reputation. He'd learned long ago that accepting every challenge was pointless, that it fed a cycle of ego and pride that had nothing to do with actual martial arts. But there was something different here. Van Damme wasn't just challenging Chuck. He was disrespecting everything the dojo represented, treating Chuck's students like they were naive, treating humility like it was weakness. Chuck looked at Van Damme for a long moment, really looked at him. Beneath the bravado and the designer clothes and the movie star confidence, he saw what he'd suspected from the beginning. A man who'd spent so long performing strength that he'd forgotten what real strength felt like. A man who measured himself by external validation, who needed audiences and recognition to feel whole. It was sad in a way. But it was also dangerous because that kind of ego could poison a space like this, could make students think that martial arts was about dominance and showmanship rather than character and discipline. If I agree to this, Chuck said slowly, it's not going to go the way you think it will. Van Damme's grin returned, triumphant. We will see about that. Chuck turned to his students. Move the mats to create an open space. This is going to be a teaching moment, but probably not the one our guest is expecting. As the students rearranged the dojo, Chuck walked to the changing room, not to put on protective gear but to center himself. He stood in front of the small mirror and looked at his own reflection. The lines on his face told stories of decades of training, of wins and losses, of the slow, hard-won wisdom that comes from confronting your own limitations and learning to accept them. He wasn't the young competitor anymore, and he didn't need to be. What he'd learned over the years was more valuable than speed or flash. When he walked back out, Van Damme had removed his jacket and was stretching ostentatiously, performing a full split that drew gasps from some of the younger students. It was impressive, undeniably so. But Chuck noticed what his students wouldn't. The way Van Damme's balance was slightly forward, the way his shoulders carried tension, the way every movement was designed to be seen rather than to be effective. They faced each other in the center of the mat. Chuck bowed, a simple gesture of respect for the practice itself. Van Damme returned it with a bow that somehow managed to be both too elaborate and too casual. Traditional rules? Van Damme asked with a smirk. Or do you want movie rules? I am good at both. We'll keep it simple, Chuck said. Light contact sparring. First to land 3 clean techniques wins. We're not here to hurt each other, just to learn. Learn, Van Damme repeated as if the word was amusing. Yes, let's learn. They began to circle each other. Van Damme moved with the kind of flashy footwork that looked great on camera, lots of movement, lots of feints and flourishes. Chuck moved economically, his stance simple and balanced, his hands relaxed but ready. He was watching, reading, understanding. Van Damme threw the first technique, a high roundhouse kick that came in fast and had the kind of extension that made for great slow-motion shots. Chuck saw it coming from the moment Van Damme's weight shifted, saw the telegraphing in the shoulder, the commitment to the big impressive strike. He simply stepped offline, let the kick pass through empty air. Van Damme recovered quickly and threw a combination of punches, again fast and technically proficient. But Chuck noticed they were the kinds of combinations you'd throw at a heavy bag or a compliant training partner, patterns rather than adaptations. He blocked the first 2 punches with minimal movement and avoided the third by taking a small step back. You're fast, Chuck said, and he meant it. Good technique. Van Damme's eyes flashed with annoyance. He didn't want compliments. He wanted to land something to prove his point. He came in more aggressively, throwing a spinning back kick that was genuinely impressive in its height and speed. Chuck could have dodged it, but he made a different choice. He caught Van Damme's leg mid-spin, not hard, just enough to stop the momentum, and for a moment held the Belgian fighter in a position where Chuck could have swept the supporting leg and put him on the ground. Instead, Chuck released the leg and stepped back. That kick works great on film, Chuck said quietly, because your opponent is trained to react a certain way. In a real situation, it leaves you exposed for too long. Van Damme's face reddened. Don't lecture me. Fight me. I am, Chuck replied. This is what fighting looks like when you've been doing it long enough. You learn to see openings, understand timing, recognize when someone's technique is built for cameras versus built for effectiveness. Van Damme came in again, and this time there was real anger behind the techniques. He threw a rapid combination that showcased his speed and his flexibility, techniques that would have looked amazing in a fight scene. But Chuck moved through them like water, redirecting, deflecting, never quite where Van Damme expected him to be. And in the spaces between Van Damme's attacks, Chuck would lightly tap him, barely making contact, just enough to demonstrate the opening. A tap to the ribs. A tap to the shoulder. A tap to the side of the head. Each tap was a lesson, and Van Damme was starting to understand that he was being schooled. His breathing got heavier, not from exertion but from frustration. He was giving everything, using his full repertoire of impressive techniques, and Chuck was making it look effortless to avoid them. The problem with performing strength, Chuck said as they circled, his voice still calm, is that you start believing your own performance. You start thinking the applause and the recognition mean you've mastered something. But mastery isn't about impressing people. It's about understanding yourself, your limitations, and working within them while constantly trying to expand them. Van Damme lunged forward with a combination ending in a jumping spinning hook kick, the kind of technique that had been his signature in dozens of films. It was beautiful to watch, acrobatic and powerful. Chuck didn't try to match it or counter with something equally flashy. He simply waited for Van Damme to land, off balance from the spin, and gently pushed him. Just a push, almost playful but perfectly timed. Van Damme stumbled backward and nearly fell. The dojo was absolutely silent. Chuck's students weren't cheering or celebrating. They understood what they were witnessing. A master teaching a difficult student, showing rather than telling, demonstrating that ego was the biggest obstacle to real learning. Van Damme straightened up, breathing hard now. His hair was disheveled, his face flushed. For the first time since walking into the dojo, he didn't look like a movie star. He looked like a man confronting a truth he didn't want to face. "You see," Chuck said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only patience, "I spent years being where you are. I thought every challenge was a test I had to pass, every confrontation was something I had to win. I built a career partly on that drive. But somewhere along the way I learned something more important. I learned that the strongest people are the ones who don't need to prove their strength. They know what they're capable of, and that's enough." Van Damme stood there, chest heaving, and Chuck could see the war happening behind his eyes. Pride fighting against understanding, ego battling with the dawning realization that he'd misread the entire situation. "Come on," Chuck said, extending his hand. "Let's call it here. You came to my school, and whether you meant to or not, you've learned something. That's what schools are for." Van Damme looked at the extended hand. The old Van Damme, the one who'd walked in 2 hours ago, would have rejected it, would have stormed out or made excuses or found a way to save face. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the way Chuck had handled him, firm but never cruel, demonstrating superiority without humiliation. Maybe it was seeing his own reflection in Chuck's patient corrections and realizing how hollow his performance had been. He reached out and took Chuck's hand. They stood there in the center of the mat, and Chuck pulled Van Damme into a brief embrace, the kind of hug that warriors give each other after a hard match. When they separated, Chuck saw that Van Damme's eyes were different now, clearer somehow. "I came here to prove something," Van Damme said quietly, speaking more to himself than anyone else. "I don't even know what anymore." "You came here because you're still searching," Chuck replied. "That's not a bad thing. It's only bad when you stop searching and start pretending you've already found everything." Chuck turned to his students who were still watching in silence. "What we just saw here is an important lesson. Jean-Claude is an incredibly talented martial artist. His technique is real, his athleticism is remarkable, and he's achieved things most people only dream of. But talent and achievement aren't the same as mastery. Mastery requires something harder, the ability to see yourself clearly, to understand your weaknesses as well as your strengths, and to keep learning even when you think you already know everything." He looked back at Van Damme. "You're welcome to stay for the rest of the class. As a student this time, not a guest. If you're interested." Van Damme hesitated, and Chuck could see the pride still fighting. But then, slowly, Van Damme nodded. "Yes, I would like that." For the next hour, Jean-Claude Van Damme trained alongside Chucknorris's students. He followed instructions without comment. He practiced basic forms he'd probably learned decades ago but had forgotten in the pursuit of flashier techniques. And slowly, gradually, Chuck watched him begin to relax, to let go of the need to be impressive and simply focus on being present. When the class ended and students began filing out, several stopped to thank Van Damme for training with them, treating him not as a celebrity but as a fellow student. Each expression of simple respect seemed to land differently than the recognition he was used to. After everyone had left, Van Damme and Chuck stood together in the empty dojo. The afternoon light was slanting through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. "I have been doing this for 40 years, Van Damme said finally. "Martial arts, action films, building a career. And I thought I understood what it was all about. But today..." He trailed off, searching for words. "Today you remembered that there's always more to learn," Chuck finished. "That's not a failure. That's the beginning of wisdom." Van Damme looked around the dojo one more time, seeing it differently now. Not as a simple space that was beneath his status, but as a place where something real happened, where people came to work on themselves without pretense or performance. "I would like to come back," he said. "If that would be okay. When I am in Texas again. Not to visit, not to demonstrate. To train." Chuck smiled, a genuine smile of respect. "The door's always open. But you come as a student, not a star." "I understand," Van Damme replied, and this time he really did. They shook hands again, and this time there was no posturing, no hidden agenda. Just two men who'd spent their lives in martial arts, acknowledging each other across the gap that separated performance from practice. After Van Damme left, Chuck stood alone in his dojo for a while, thinking about the strange circuitousness of the path. How you could spend decades building a reputation, achieving recognition, becoming known worldwide, and still miss the fundamental point. How the loudest demonstrations of strength were often covering for the deepest doubts. How the real work of martial arts, the work that actually mattered, happened in quiet rooms with no cameras and no audiences, just people trying to be better than they were yesterday. He thought about his own journey, all the times he'd been the young fighter convinced he had something to prove, all the challenges he'd accepted that he should have declined, all the ways he'd equated winning with worth. It had taken him years, decades really, to understand that true strength was quieter than that, more subtle. It was the strength to walk away from fights that didn't matter. The strength to help someone learn even when they were being difficult. The strength to be secure enough in yourself that you didn't need constant validation. That night, Chuck received a text message from an unknown number. It was brief. "Thank you for the lesson I did not know I needed. I will remember this." It was unsigned, but Chuck knew who it was from. He smiled and deleted the message. Some lessons didn't need to be preserved or documented. They just needed to be learned. In the weeks that followed, Chuck noticed a subtle shift in how his students approached their training. Several came to him privately and talked about their own struggles with ego, with the need to be seen and validated, with the difficulty of staying humble in a world that constantly rewarded showmanship over substance. The incident with Van Damme had sparked something, made them reflect on their own motivations for training. Chuck used those conversations to dig deeper into what martial arts was really about at its core. Not the kicks and the punches, not the belts and the rankings, but the internal work of understanding yourself, your fears, your pride, your limitations. The work of becoming someone who could be strong without needing to prove it, skilled without needing to show it off, confident without needing constant reassurance. 3 months later, Jean-Claude Van Damme walked back into the dojo. This time there was no Porsche, no leather jacket, no sunglasses. He arrived in a simple car, wearing plain workout clothes, and entered with a bow. He didn't announce himself or make a show of being there. He simply took a place among the other students and waited for class to begin. Chuck acknowledged him with a nod, nothing more, and Van Damme seemed grateful for the understated recognition. For the next several weeks, whenever Van Damme was in Texas, he would come to the dojo and train. Not as a guest, not as a celebrity, but as a student genuinely trying to learn. The other students welcomed him without fuss. There were no requests for autographs or photos, no special treatment. In Chuck's dojo, everyone was equal in their pursuit of improvement. And in that equality, Van Damme seemed to find something he'd been searching for without realizing it. A space where he could stop performing and start being. One evening, after a particularly grueling session focused on basic defensive techniques, Van Damme approached Chuck as they were cleaning up the training area. "Can I ask you something?" Van Damme said. "Of course. When I first came here, you could have destroyed me. Embarrassed me completely. Made me look foolish in front of everyone. Why didn't you?" Chuck paused in wiping down a section of mat. "Because that's not what teaching is about. Humiliation doesn't create learning, it creates resentment. I wanted you to understand something, not hate me for proving a point. But I was arrogant. Disrespectful." "You were struggling," Chuck corrected. "There's a difference. Arrogance comes from insecurity, and insecurity comes from not knowing yourself well enough. You weren't my enemy. You were just someone who needed to be reminded that there's always more to learn." Van Damme was quiet for a moment. "In my life in Hollywood, everyone wants to tear you down. Everyone wants to see you fail so they can feel better about themselves. I forgot that there was another way. That someone could be strong enough to correct you without destroying you. That's the difference between power and strength," Chuck said. "Power is about dominating others. Strength is about mastering yourself. Real strength doesn't need to diminish anyone else to exist." They finished cleaning in comfortable silence. As Van Damme was leaving, he turned back one more time. "I'm going to keep coming back," he said. "Not just when I'm in Texas. I'm going to make time for it. Because I think I've been missing this my whole career." "You're always welcome," Chuck replied. "The dojo will be here." And it was true. Long after the Hollywood careers faded, long after the fame and the recognition became footnotes in history, places like Chuck's dojo would still be standing. Still teaching the same fundamental lessons about discipline, respect, humility, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing yourself well enough that you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Years later, in an interview promoting his latest film, Van Damme was asked about the secret to longevity in action films, about staying relevant in an industry that constantly looked for the next big thing. His answer surprised the interviewer. "The secret is knowing the difference between being famous and being good," Van Damme said. "Fame comes and goes. It's about other people's opinions, other people's attention. But being good, really good at something, that's internal. That's about your relationship with yourself and your craft." I learned that from Chucknorris, not in a movie but in his dojo in Texas. He showed me that the strongest people are the ones who have nothing left to prove. When Chuck heard about the interview, he smiled but didn't comment publicly. That wasn't his way. He simply continued teaching his students, continued running his modest dojo, continued being a living example of the principles he'd spent a lifetime learning. Because in the end that was what real mastery looked like. Not the big gestures or the public victories or the dramatic confrontations. Just the daily practice of being better than you were yesterday, of helping others on their own journeys, of understanding that strength doesn't shout, it whispers. And the wisest among us learned to listen. The final lesson, the one that Van Damme finally understood and that Chuck had known all along, was simple. You can spend your whole life trying to prove you're the best, or you can spend it actually becoming better. Only one of those paths leads to peace. Only one of those paths leads to real strength. And only one of those paths creates a legacy that matters beyond the spotlight and the applause. Chuck Norris understood that. He'd always understood it. And on that day in his dojo, he'd given Jean-Claude Van Damme the gift of understanding it too. Not through humiliation or dominance, but through patient demonstration of what true mastery actually looked like. In a world full of people shouting about their strength, Chuck Norris had shown what it meant to be strong enough that you never needed to raise your voice at all.